Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I read a report in the paper last week that was really, I don't know if it's shocking is the right word, but was surprising in regards to mental health during the pandemic. And I think a lot of us, have heard lots of stories about different people that have had mental health issues and thought that mental health was a real issue. And this report actually, I guess, was encouraging, very encouraging, because it said that mental health wasn't as big of an issue as a lot of us thought. And actually, what I think the answer from the authors, the researchers is that what it identified was that we're very resilient and that we've dealt with and can deal with a lot of stuff in our lives. And so I really wanted to reach out to them and hear a little bit more about their study and what they think the implications are. So I want to introduce you tonight to Brett Thombs and Danielle Rice. Brett is a Canadian Research Chair and Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University. And he's a senior researcher at the Lady Davis Institute of the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. Danielle Rice is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University and a clinical and health psychologist in supervised practice at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton. I really want to ask you about behavioral neurosciences later on if we get a chance, because that sounds really kind of fascinating as well. Anyway, Brett and Danielle, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Brian. It's great to be here.
My pleasure. So, this study, Brett, maybe I could start with you, of COVID-19 and mental health. It's been really quite, I think, the discussion in the last little while since you've released your report. Why'd you do this research?
Well, we have a really strong belief and that we should be learning about people's health and making decisions based on good evidence for everything we do. And there's been some real miracles in during the pandemic. Some of the vaccine research that went on and some other research that went on some of the treatments is really underlying the importance of science. But at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot was being said about mental health, and there were really good reasons to be really worried about it. There wasn't much evidence. And when we did see evidence coming out, people were doing something like taking a snapshot. They'd go out and hand out a questionnaire to people. You'd answer these questions, they'd score it somehow, and they kind of look at it today and say, well, this looks really bad. It must be because of the pandemic. But if I ask you today, Brian, how are you doing? You say, I'm doing so-so. It depends. Like if you were devastated yesterday, so-so would be pretty darn good. On the other hand, if you got married yesterday and we're celebrating, if you're only doing so-so today, I'd be worried. So without knowing what happens, we don't know how to interpret what's going on today. And that was exactly what was going on. If you want to learn about change, you have to have a before and an after. So what we did, we started back then. It's been a monster project. It's nothing. We've never done anything like this. We have a team of about a dozen people here that have gone through 95,000 studies to look for ones that
95,000.
95,000. They've opened the abstracts, then they've gone into the full articles for ones. We've looked for studies that were tracking mental health before the pandemic, and then tracked mental health during the pandemic. So in some ways, it's very simple, right? What did you know beforehand? What did you know during? And we compared those. And we looked at the general population, and we looked at about 11 other groups by age or gender and other characteristics whenever we could find data. And, essentially what we found, we looked at a few outcomes: depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, general mental health was a mix of those two. And, I wouldn't say it's not a big issue, if I can reframe this. I would say it's not a catastrophe. It's not a tsunami. It's not a pandemic of mental health. There were some negative changes. But when we did find changes, we found in some cases there weren't any changes. And we did find changes that were minimal to small magnitude or amounts across the population. So I think it's a lot more nuanced situation than what's been put out there along the way.
What was exactly the research question you were trying to address? And you addressed this by going through this 90,000 different abstracts. Is that correct?
Yeah, we wanted to know if mental health had changed. Has mental health changed during the pandemic from before the pandemic? And we found we had to go through 95,000 studies out there that had said something about mental health. We found our 137 that covered about 170,000 people, and we evaluated their change from prior to the pandemic to during the pandemic. Now, almost all these data were from 2020. There were only a few studies that went longer than that, but at least during 2020, we don't. When we say it's minimal, there was either no change or minimal to small change. There's a lot of messiness in these data, so we don't know, exactly what precise. If there's a little bit of change, I wouldn't bet my house on exactly how much there was. But what we can be very confident in, that when there was change, it was pretty small. And so with that's consistent across the board. There weren't these big catastrophic
Really,
declines in mental health.
that's interesting, and maybe we'll come back and ask you about whether the fact that you did it in 2020 primarily was one of the reasons. Danielle, maybe I can ask you. I've heard lots of stories about high school kids. In fact, I was at dinner just last week where someone that said, their child was just graduating from grade 12 this year, and in Ontario, and so they had spent 3 or 4 years with no football, no clubs, no students council, and so a lot of those things that I remember is so critically important in my adolescent, they missed out for years. Was mental health the same for everyone, or were there some groups, like I would have thought, teenagers that suffered a great deal more?
Yeah, really good question. And as you said, certainly there were life changes for everyone. And in an age like high school, those are big changes, like sports being different and class being online, things that hadn't been the same before. But even when we looked at the specific categories, the main change that was found, that's a little bit more nuanced, as Brett said, more of a change was among women and females. This is one subgroup where there were some small negative effects, but to the extent that they were pretty consistently found with each of these outcomes. So that was one subgroup that we looked at, and that there was enough data to speak to some small negative differences that were found among women and females in the pandemic. The other subgroups that we looked at, we just didn't find those results.
Okay, so let's talk about females then for a second, if we could, Danielle. We had lots of comments about the Great Resignation. Now it's the Great Breakup, that females during COVID, took too much, particularly working moms, of the share of the workload, as they had to teach at home and cook at home and work at home and do all of the stuff. And some people have suggested it was almost a couple generation backward move in the role of female in the workplace. Women's participation in the labor force, I understand, is down. And, McKinsey and other people have come out with this term just recently about the Great Breakup, saying that there's, a large number of females that are breaking up from the corporate world because they actually liked not having to commute. So tell me about how females dealt with COVID.
Sure. And I'll certainly start by saying that we were most focused on the aspect of change as opposed to why the change happened. So I won't say that our study can answer that exact question,
Okay.
But certainly there are pieces that can inform why this could have happened. And as you mentioned, Brian, a lot of women were in roles that they were taking on extra childcare in their workplace. They're still working from home while trying to navigate childcare. Some of them managing elder care. Also, a lot of the healthcare workforce is made up of females. This is the majority of nurses are females among various other professions here at the hospital, which means some of these women are navigating now, how do I do childcare while also being in the hospital? How do I keep my family safe, for example? And these are responsibilities that, a lot of women may face that perhaps others did not face. And again, our study didn't specifically answer that question, but those are some of the things that we considered, as well as certainly interpartner violence is something to consider. That's often women that are the victims of that.
Well, we'll have to come back maybe and talk about that too, because I understand divorces are up, but maybe you've got different studies that suggest I'm wrong in that assumption. Brett, were you surprised by the findings? I think in the final paragraph or two of the article I read about your study, one of your conclusions, or at least what was in the article, is that we are very resilient, and probably more resilient than I guess a lot of people thought we were going to be. When you think about a 100-year pandemic, it should have been a bit of a shock to the system. And what I read from your findings is that mental health wasn't a big issue, and that we're actually pretty good at dealing with big, massive negative changes.
Well, I think there's a few points there that you brought up, Brian, that are important to talk about. This actually relates back to a couple of minutes ago when we were talking about, you brought up some people who had instances of children or themselves who are struggling in mental health, and that's clearly objective that it happened, right? So I think one thing that's important to take away from here too is that the pandemic was a mixed and messy bag. It affected people in different ways. You brought up the Great Breakup and people leaving work. Some people's lives have improved across the pandemic. They've changed their priorities. So when talking about the Great Breakup, these are people reprioritizing and figuring out how they want to live out the rest of their lives after they've got a taste of something different in the pandemic. And many of them are happy with this. There's people who are commuting less. An administrator at my job at the Jewish General told me at one point anecdotally, I commute 3 hours a day. I haven't commuted in the pandemic. Now I'm home for dinner with my kids. I hope they let me keep doing this because my life is made world of difference. So some people have actually gotten better. Many have coped and stayed the same, and some people have really had terrible experiences with mental health. So keep in mind that when our study is on the aggregate, it means it's on average what's happened across the population, and that many people have had different experiences across that spectrum. Yeah, I think we were surprised. This all happened very, very fast, and like you said, none of us had ever seen anything like this. Um, there are people in our population, some of the older folks out there have lived through the World War, and terrible things that went along with that. There's Holocaust survivors that are out there, but most of most of us haven't seen any kind of challenge like this at all. This was just, and yeah, I think we jumped, and ourselves included, to the assumption that bad event, mental health decline. And I think though what we're missing here is a middle piece in there. Bad event, all the negative experiences that go with it, and then what happens there, and does it result in a mental health decline or not? So, everyone went through awful situations. If you ask people, were you lonely? Sure. Did you miss out on your work? Yes. Did you miss out on sporting events? Were you frustrated? Were you angry? Was your learning more difficult? This was a really rough and tough situation for across the board, but that's not the same. And having those kind of feelings, and even losing people lost people out there, and it's just terrible. But that's not the same as a mental health difficulty. Some of that is part of being human. We are sad sometimes, and we are challenged, and we are angry, and we lose our cool, and all these things happen. And then on the other side of that, in the reflection, we experience joy and love and all the things that go with it. You don't really have one of those sides without the other one. Now, in the pandemic, we had an awful lot of one of those sides. It was an awful lot of bad stuff going on. But what resilience means is that when you face these kind of challenges, these new challenges, there's no one recipe. But does it mean, do you find a way to pick yourself up and pick each other up and move forward and maintain yourself and do the things and get back to where you want to do? And that's what resilience is about. And that could mean many different things for different people. That could mean, I'm going to go out and keep my exercise routine going because this helps me. That could mean I'm going to learn how to use technology. I'm a 65-year-old, and I'm going to learn how to use technology, and I'm going to do a Zoom coffee with my other retirees who I go to coffee with all the time, and we're going to do that, and we're going to commiserate and make that work. And again, our study isn't a story that everything was hunky-dory. I'm stealing Danielle's words, by the way, from the other quote in the paper. It wasn't a story everything was hunky-dory, but it was a story that is multifaceted. There's two sides, and people struggled and suffered, but people were also doing remarkable things. On my street in Montreal, they were going out. I didn't join them, by the way, for whatever that's worth. We don't have to talk about that. They were going out and doing, but I thought it was remarkable. They were doing socially distanced exercise in the street with a boombox, and they've kept doing it 3 years later. So, people supported each other. They got support. And so I think that's the part of the story that's missing. And I think if there's something from our study that we were surprised, I think retrospectively, maybe we were naive because society didn't collapse emotionally from some of these traumas way back that some of the older folks in our society have seen. So maybe we shouldn't have been surprised, but we were. But that's the key thing, though, too. There are multiple facets to this, and there terrible things happen, but people responded and support each other, and they did what we needed to do, and they helped each other to keep on keeping on. And that's the part we don't want people to forget here.
So what I took away from what you just said and what I read about your study was encouraging, that we're incredibly resilient people. Is that what I should take from this?
Danielle, do you want to comment on that, Danielle?
Yeah, I think that's exactly an important point that would be taken. And even if we can say certainly some people struggled, and we don't take away from that, also we were resilient and adapted and tried to pivot in this massive life change that happened for everyone. So yeah, I think you got the message really well there, Brian. Well,
that's a very encouraging conclusion. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Danielle and Brett and talk a little bit more about the study and some of my questions about it and some of the implications. Stay with us, everyone. Brian Crombie on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. This study was released, at least I read about it just a week ago or so, about mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was really quite I was surprised by the conclusion, encouraged at the same time, because what it said to me is that even though we had lots of challenges in the pandemic, we as a people were very resilient and got through the pandemic better than a lot of people thought, and we were able to deal with it. And when you think about a thing that happens once in 100 years and put a lot of people out of work, and a lot of companies were struggling with financial issues, and people lost time at school, etc. To think that we actually are so resilient that we could deal with it is really encouraging for us as a human race and us as a community. We're joined tonight by the two researchers, Brett Thombs and Danielle Rice. Brett is Canadian Research Chair and Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University, and Danielle is a assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry, and I love this, behavioral neuroscience at McMaster University. Again, I really want to find out what behavioral neuroscience is. I interviewed a senior person, and maybe I can ask Danielle this, at the LCBO, and they said that, and this was, I think, in the fall of 2020, that liquor sales were up like 20-25%. So people at that time were turning to alcohol in a far greater manner. Doesn't that suggest, maybe it's just an antidote, but it's not fact. But to have that kind of increase in alcohol, that's got to suggest something, no?
Yeah, I think it suggests that more people were buying alcohol. We don't know if they were necessarily drinking it. We don't know what they were doing with it, but certainly it's a finding that, if I don't know the data behind it, but certainly it's something that we can consider and ask questions as to why. Alcohol doesn't directly lead to or mean negative coping, unless that's the sole coping strategy being used. But certainly that's something to consider, and think about how substances were used at that time. If they were used like socially over Zoom, as Brett had mentioned, or if these are used as the only coping strategy someone has. So yeah, I think it's something absolutely to consider. Our findings didn't look specifically at those sales, but I don't think that we could directly link that to mental health. If we could, I would say it sounds like perhaps some individuals use this as a way to still be social, even while not connected physically with each other. So I don't have much judgment on that myself, but maybe I'll open it to Brett in case he has different perspectives.
Well, I have to confess that my wife and I bought more wine also during the early parts of the pandemic. But I think it's just because, maybe it was because the commute time was less. We had a little bit longer time to sleep in the morning. But yeah, I think Danielle's made a good point. It probably did for some people out there indicate some negative coping and some problematic coping and some struggling. But for many people, it probably indicated some other things, that they had more time on their hands. They were home with doing other things. So it's hard to interpret that, and we aren't in the end, we aren't dishwashers, right? We're a little puzzle where you do X and it automatically leads to Y by changing a part. We're a lot more complex than that. So what that actually means is hard to know. Yeah.
Brett, I asked Danielle about high school students. Let me ask you, if I could, about another age segment. My mother recently passed away, and she was in her late 80s. Very social person, going to church all the time, bridge all the time, aqua fitness, all those kinds of things, which all came to an end. And she adapted a little bit by doing bridge online and Bible studies online and stuff like that. But she really missed that social interaction, both with her friends and her church family, but also with her own family, because my sister was quite concerned about the health issues and restricted all of our access to her, particularly if we had been out seeing other people. How did the elderly deal with COVID-19? What was their impact on mental health? Yeah,
there's a couple of aspects what you brought up there, Brian, that are important. One is about data we didn't have, and that's not just for the elderly, but if you think about it, we didn't did this by collecting data. We went out and counted on what other people had collected, and so we were missing some key population demographics in terms of but one of them, I think, we do have data on elderly people or older people, but I'm quite sure we didn't have data. They weren't collecting data for people who were in those elder homes where everyone was dying at the beginning of the pandemic. So I think that's a real gap there. So obviously those people suffered terribly. So when they collected data on older people that we were able to bring into our report, I think there were people out in the community who weren't at the in the middle of the twister there. But at the same time, it was a little bit mixed bag. We found a little bit, again, like not for all across. They weren't so anxious or otherwise. We found a little bit of a blip up downward in depression symptoms for older people. Again, it's indicating that some people had struggles and didn't. I was on had another conversation recently with someone who does work closely with the older population, who brought up the idea that it was quite a mixed bag. That the more people learned to use technology, and there were people in their 70s and 80s who were getting on and using Zoom and these kind of things for the first time in their lives. In fact, I think, and we've heard stories about some people who are keeping touch more than ever before with grandparents because now they're on Zoom, they hadn't done it. So, but at the same time, there were a lot of them that were a lot more isolated. And I suspect that there were people that this was really a difficult experience, and they weren't able to do some of these things that kept them going, exactly like you're saying.
That's interesting. It's in my own family. We started having Zoom meetings on birthdays and Christmases and holidays and stuff like that with people from the Nova Scotia and Alberta and Toronto and Ottawa all at the same time, which is something we didn't do. We waited till we had a chance to all get together, and so we actually, ironically, were more connected during the pandemic, albeit electronically, than we probably had been previously. So that's interesting. Danielle,
yeah,
maybe,
there's other stories like that. There's other stories like that. I just had someone tell me yesterday, one of the women who works with us in scleroderma, rare disease work, that said exactly that. Every Friday now, they never did it before, they have 25 to 30 people from her family on a Zoom call from across the country, ongoing. So,
Danielle, let's come back to females, if we could, and this interesting, extra work that a lot of people said that the typical mom, the typical female, ended up taking on because. And it was almost a description of that she had to go back to become like the 1950s housewife. That too much of the home care, too much of the education, too much of everything, and then at the same time she still had to work. Ended up being taken on by the females in the house. Is that true? Is that just a story? And how did people deal with it?
Yeah, I have to say, when you describe it it actually kind of frustrates me that this seems to fall on women and these social constructs that still exist, where it's, you said the typical mom is having to do this, and we have two parents in many families, not all families, not all are women and men, but I'll just give my reactions. It's still kind of frustrating to hear that the automatic thought is that it's the mom's role, or that seems to be what could have been taken on by many women and females. Again, we don't know for sure that this is the why, but I think it certainly makes sense that if you're taking on multiple roles, trying to hold things together and complete many tasks in the same amount of time that you had previously, this causes a challenge. And how you cope with that challenge and the support that you have, we know practical support and emotional support help families, including mothers, and that practical support couldn't be provided to the same extent it used to be. I mean, things like having cleaners come support and clean your home to offload some of that work, that couldn't happen. Things like having some nanny care or childcare for pickups, like these were all taken away. That's that practical support piece that was drastically changed, and if not eliminated for some time. So I think it's fair to consider that this could be linked, especially unfortunately for women and females who had lots of these extra responsibilities in their role as a parent.
I was surprised by how many people I knew that were so pleased to be able to go get their hair done for the first time when things opened up, or their nails done or something like that. So some of those little things that people enjoy having done for them were something they missed, but then they were really excited when they got it back. Danielle, is it as simple to say that it's resilience? Like what was the reason why your research showed that there wasn't a bigger negative impact on mental health?
Yeah, I think Brett described the resilience piece so well. Other considerations are certainly that social cohesion that I think Brett described, with people, again, pivoting and adapting and still trying to find ways to connect with others. So I think the resilience that many of us have or try to build up, the social cohesion. And the other reality is that there were some changes more at the policy level at various different jurisdictional settings. So whether that's local or provincial and national, there were, for example, more access to some mental health supports that were not available prior to the pandemic. So things like Wellness Together Canada is the one I often think of, that was designed specifically in response to the pandemic. Unfortunately, it was not available before, but nonetheless, that's something that provided free counseling to anyone to access that resource, and also developed many of these different self-help supports that others did not have access to for mental health support. So I think that's another consideration, is that the resilience, the social connectedness that we tried to maintain and build, and also some changes that did happen more at that global level for access to some care.
Brett, social cohesion, you and Danielle have talked about. A lot of bosses today are desperate for companies to go back to work full time, get out of this stay at home and hybrid. And they keep on saying, and I keep on hearing these quotes about you can't build culture on Zoom. Can you have social cohesion through Zoom, through electronic communication? Do you need face-to-face personal interaction to create social cohesion, or can you actually do it through a video screen?
Oh, that's a good question. And that's not something we've studied, so I'll go ahead and jump in and speculate. How's that? But we have, our own team. We have 25 or 35 researchers that work in our group on our projects here, and I think it depends. We found that when you know people and you've been working with them, that it's a plus and minus. Sure, it's great to sit down and have a chance to walk down the hallway and ask a question easily, or go get a coffee and lunch. And we do lose those kind of things that are helpful. When you already have those relationships, though, I think there's the positive trade-offs of maybe being able to stay at home and be closer to your kids, or stay at home and not have a commute. So people make their own decisions on what works for them. I think it's been really tough on younger people. So we do have I'm getting old enough I can call them younger people now, right? The 20-somethings on the team that are highly skilled and learning their jobs. I think that's been really tricky for them. They were really wanting to get back to the office, and we were in a hospital setting. So for a long time, until not so long ago, we weren't able to go back in the hospital because they really only wanted essential healthcare personnel in the hospital, not other people traipsing through if you could do your jobs at home. So that was a real challenge. And I think that was very difficult for some of the younger people, both in terms of learning their jobs. It's a lot easier if you can just turn around and ask somebody a question and get information. Also in terms of the social aspects of it, that they were in small apartments by themselves oftentimes and really missed that. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think everyone in their own businesses is going to have to evaluate their situation and talk to their employees and figure out what works best for them.
But I think one of the things that you mentioned, I certainly believe, and again, I've got no facts for sure, no research to back this up, but I do think that you can have a relationship with people on an ongoing basis electronically if you've met them personally already and you've already established a relationship. There was a study done on telephones where at one point in time, and you may know this study, I can't remember when it was, but it was a big study because people were worried about telephones back in the 1950s and 60s. The telephones would take people away from social interaction, and what they found is it magnified their social interaction, because if they knew people already, then they'd hop on the telephone and start talking to people. And then it was duplicated with Facebook and things like that, that it magnified the relationships you already had. And I think that's sort of the truth, is that if you have a personal relationship with people already, then the electronic communication can actually benefit because of all the reasons that you talked about it. I do think it was a big problem for people that never had that personal relationship to start with. I interviewed one person, I think it was a year ago, that was leaving a company, and they had joined the company in 2020 and left in 2022, and they had never met someone face to face in 2 years of a job. And one of the reasons why they left is they said, I never met anybody. I never met them. And other than maybe when they picked up their computer. Brett, what's the implication of all this? How is this going to change, what we should do from a policy standpoint, if anything at all?
Well, I think there's a few messages for those people out there who are involved in policy at the government level or at the hospital level. But one is that, we need data. That we don't have a good surveillance system for mental health in Canada. That if you look at our study of 137 studies, there were, I think, 4 Canadian studies out there where individual researchers were collecting their data and produced reports. But we didn't have the kind of big national level surveillance reports that we were able to rely on from the United Kingdom or from the Netherlands. And those are critical. And, we kind of got caught with our pants down here. And I think we need to have a surveillance system. We need to have our thumbs on the pulse of people in Canada anyway, at all times, to figure out what's happening with mental health. There are a lot of challenges anyway. And that's a message here. We need to pull ourselves together across provinces and the federal level and put together a good surveillance system. And Danielle mentioned additional access for resources for people in the pandemic. And we've dissuaded people from using the word crisis about mental health changes during COVID, but there was a crisis here. And the crisis was that if you do have a mental health problem before the pandemic, if you did, you
Got
couldn't,
worse.
you couldn't, well, you couldn't get timely treatment then. You couldn't come to me and say, I'm suffering with my scleroderma. Can I see it? I don't have a private insurance. How do I see a psychologist? And I work in the system, and that's not an easy puzzle to solve. Can you see someone in a timely fashion? Can you get the care you need? Can you get as much care as you need? And I think that there needs to be some serious accounting for how to take care of people's needs. That's a crisis situation that was there before the pandemic and is still there.
We're chatting tonight about mental health during the pandemic, and the finding that actually we were really pretty resilient and dealt with things fairly well. And I think that's a very encouraging finding and a little bit surprising. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Brett and Danielle. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is mental health during the pandemic. My guests are Brett Thombs, I apologize, who is the Canadian Research Chair and Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University and a Senior Researcher at the Lady Davis Institute of the Jewish General Hospital, and Danielle Rice, who is an Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at the McMaster University and a clinical and health psychologist in supervised practice at St. Joseph's Healthcare, Hamilton. They've issued a report recently that studied mental health during the pandemic, and that they came to the conclusion, I think, that mental health wasn't a serious issue, that people dealt with challenges very well. And their bottom line answer was that we're reasonably resilient. And I think that's actually an incredibly encouraging finding. I'm going to ask you a question, Danielle, if I could. Your study was during 2020, and I think about the trucker convoy in January, February of 2022. Do you think your statistics are maybe wrong because you just did it in 2020 and it took a while for sort of negative impacts to build up? I think about 15% of the population that supposedly supported the trucker convoy. I didn't, and I thought it was wrong, but 15% of the population were frustrated, and not 15% went to Ottawa, but some small percentage went to Ottawa, and one of the worst sort of civil disobedience acts in Canadian history, other than maybe the FLQ crisis back when the War Measures Act was put in place. So do you think that because you just did 2020, we may have bad numbers, that if you actually did it for 2021 and 2022, when the impact started building more and more and resentment started building more, that you would have got a different answer?
One thing I'll say in this, and I'll actually ask Brett too. Brett, can you confirm we took data and we took all the data available until April 2021 or 2022?
2020, anything that had been published by April 2022 is in this report.
So I was thinking about that this morning, where we're limited by the data that's available, but we took all the data that was available until April 2022. So just wanted to flag that anything that you're not seeing, it's not that we're trying to omit it, it's that we couldn't, it's not there yet. So again, I think that lens towards what Brett said is we need some more surveillance data. We need some of this available so that we can publish and speak to that question directly. I don't think that that the findings that we have are bad findings or are incorrect. Certainly, I would imagine, as you're noting, that if we were looking specifically at frustration or questions with how much do you agree with what government does, before a pandemic or after, perhaps that data would look a little bit different. But again, we're looking pretty specifically at mental health symptoms and mental health conditions. And what you noted with the trucker convoy, those actions, like typically when someone's depressed, they're not really engaging in a lot of activities. That doesn't so much look like depressive symptoms from my understanding and my education and treatment of these conditions. And anxiety is usually avoiding things that cause distress, cause worry. So what you're describing really doesn't align so much with the outcomes we were looking at for mental health. So I wouldn't expect so much of that change, especially in context of the trucker convoy, but certainly more information is going to be helpful, more data that's released later, which we are collecting and will be able to speak to, but I wouldn't expect there's going to be a huge shift a different way, simply because also there's a natural trajectory of recovery in different traumas, and it more looks like a curve that goes down, certainly with some little spikes, but I wouldn't, based on previous research and clinical knowledge, I wouldn't expect so much that trauma recovery curve all of a sudden spikes back up. But again, we have to, we're somewhat limited to the data that's available.
But if I can add quickly, we do have a couple of best studies I mentioned out there, the big national studies from Europe that did track farther into 2021 and the end of it. They both showed that symptoms went down or stayed stable. So we are collecting more data, as Danielle said. It's a monster project. We're putting it together, and we will have more from across the pandemic. But indications we have right now is that in fact, it didn't get worse, and as exactly as Danielle said, might have gotten a little bit better in case it had flipped at the beginning.
So Brett, this was not just Canada, this was a global study?
These were global studies. These were anyone who published anything. So there were studies from 31 countries. Most of them were, middle to high income countries. The majority were from, Canada, the US, North America, and Europe that we put together.
Brett, how do you explain this? How do you reconcile this finding with all of the, media reports and other things that we've heard that suggest that mental health was a big issue? And that mental health services went up, that alcohol went up, that divorces went up, that how do you reconcile your findings with all of the media reports that are in the opposite direction of what you found?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are going on. One, I mentioned at the beginning, that people were publishing these snapshot studies and using these questionnaires. But not only the problem with these questionnaires is that, when you answer questions on a mental health questionnaire, you get a score, whether you know it or not. And these, in academia, we have a line here. If you get above a certain score, clinically, like in this clinic where Danielle works, we think, oh, maybe we should talk to this person to see if they have a mental health problem. It's like if you have a mammography, we should do more exams to see if there might be breast cancer. Now, in both those cases, most of the people who get flagged don't have the condition. So, most people who have a positive mammography don't have breast cancer in the end, thank goodness. And most people who get above these lines don't have a mental health problem. But what people were doing, they were taking these lines and they were saying, 30% and 40% have a problem. They're putting big numbers out there and then talking about it. And like I said, when we actually looked at those changes, those numbers were like that before the pandemic. So I think that was one of the problems. But I think, I think things are changing now. Most academics are keen to follow data and learn from it. We've had a lot of people reach out to us since we published this report, even those who were saying things that we had a lot of problems a year or two ago, saying that they've learned from what we've done. But, there's still exceptions out there, right? I presented this data in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, and a prominent infectious diseases guy stood up and said, why did you even do this work? We all know that this didn't impact anybody's mental health in the general population. We already knew that. It's only the people in healthcare, and we know that they were hit really hard. So I don't know why you had to do this research. Now, a couple of days ago, on the other hand, another infectious diseases guy on a TV show said, well, he didn't criticize our methods or our point on the flaws. He said, I know this research is wrong. I know, but I've seen people with mental health problems. This can't be right. And we should all just follow his heart. And so I think that this is an important question. What people see all sorts of reports in the media here. And, as reporters, as academics, we do get riled up when people don't follow the science. Hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine is a big example of that, right? We, the medications that were out there that there are all sorts of claims being made that it was a lifesaver. But when researchers put it together in one of the Nature journals, one of the top ones, and there were 28 trials, they found that these didn't help anybody. And that in fact, chloroquine, people died more if they took it. So there's still a lot of forceful rhetoric about people being denied those treatments during the pandemic. So we need to remember our frustration when people don't use science. And I think when people see someone on the television, if they're critical of science and they're telling people why they're being critical and why the science may be wrong, they should pay a lot of close attention to it. But if they see scientists on the television or otherwise saying they just think something's wrong because they disbelieve that, that's not really a scientist anymore. That's just another guy at the end of the bar. And
but this was an infectious disease expert that told you this.
Yeah. Both sides of the coin. Both sides of the coin that either they already knew this or that we were clearly wrong. So I think that, so when you see people on the TV telling you things, make sure they tell you why and have a good explanation. If they just tell you their opinion, again, they're just like another guy sitting at the end of the bar, and they treat their opinions like that, but it's not a good source of information for making your choices.
But Danielle, we heard so many stories of people that, you know, had divorce, that you know, were sitting at home in a darkened room, that missed their whatever, their social interaction, their high school hockey, their you know, everything. We heard story after story after story. Are you just drowning in the numbers and ignoring the real people stories?
The nice thing is the numbers are real people stories. It's real people that made up all these 137 studies. And I sit with real people each day. And you know what I can tell you is that our hospital, for example, some of these changes as we can provide more treatment. So you're mentioning the service goes up. Well, that probably suggests stigma has been a little impacted in a positive way, that the awareness of how to refer people is now being more well known. And also now that a lot of things are virtual, we can't fit 12 people in our nice group room, but we can fit 12 people on a Zoom screen. So certainly there's been some increased access and awareness of services, and in some ways that's positive, that we don't have to have people waiting for their in-person chair that they can physically sit on. They can come and join us by Zoom and access these services. And I think that's a plus. And these stories that you mentioned with individuals who are suffering, that's why we do this work, because there are individuals in this pandemic that have suffered. There are people who have experienced negative outcomes. As Brett said, I changed my language yesterday. It's not all rainbows and sunshines. I thought that sounded more professional. It's not all rainbows and sunshine. And for those people that are suffering, that's where we want care to be available, as opposed to this idea that everyone needs mental health care now. Everyone has a mental health condition that will absolutely overwhelm the services and not allow those who are, as you said, you know, stuck in the basement, that will take away their access. And that's absolutely not what we want.
Brett, where does resilience come from?
That's a great question, Brian. I don't think I know. Honestly, it's a big picture. Why do we support each other the way we do? Why do we find a way to get through things? And why do we achieve goals? I don't know. I think we're for some reason we're like that. You know, people go through terrible experiences. They go through the world wars and what went on there. It's very anecdotal. If you look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, what some people are doing to support each other and others there, and under terrible circumstances, you know, you see this anecdotal. You see that people going in the streets in Kiev and playing music when the bombs stop falling. Why do we do? I don't know, Brian. I don't know why we do these things, but
There
we
was
certainly
this
seem to do them.
there was this significant study that I read at one point in time of social capital in Italy, and it compared social capital in northern Italy versus southern Italy. And it said that in northern Italy, the community was really important. The people went out to help each other, and you know, blood donor clinics and all this other stuff. And in southern Italy, for some reason, it was just about your family, and that was it. You didn't worry about the balance of the community. And they did a lot of tracks of emergencies, of you know, mudslides and tornadoes and storms and economic collapses, and found that northern Italy was far more resilient and adapted far quicker than southern Italy. And they concluded that it had something to do with social capital. It had to do with these interactions with other people. What do you think? Does that make any sense? Is that possible?
Well, I sure it is, but I think there's different. You know, there's a good point you're bringing up across the world, but there are different ways that people go about it. You know, some communities are based much more strongly on the family. Here in North America, we're much more individualistic. But I think in you know, and I don't know which one works better, but in each case, people come together somehow. You know, we're as individualistic as you can in North America, and I think people have been worried we're increasingly fragmented with the internet and everyone on their own. But you know, people did good things to support each other during the pandemic, even here, and a lot of good things. So I think it's an open book. It's going to be really interesting to see what people produce when they study what happened in the pandemic along these kind of lines.
Danielle, I got to ask you, you know, I haven't heard this term behavioral neuroscience before. What is behavioral neuroscience, and does that have an answer to where resilience comes from?
So this is, Brian, this is the hardest question you have asked me today. In that department name, I'm under the psychiatry and by default psychology side, as opposed to behavioral neurosciences. So I know behavioral, you know what? No, I can't even speak to it. Neuroscience and behavioral neurosciences is actually way outside of my wheelhouse, despite that I'm in that department. I feel like I fit in that department well. I am competent, but I'm competent on the psychiatry side. So I don't know if it has answers, but it's above my head if it does.
Fair answer. Good answer. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna have to find someone in behavioral neuroscience to interview to answer the question. Because actually, I think there is something. I interviewed an economist just last week about behavioral economics and how our biases change. You know, rational economic man. And I think there is something about the behavioral aspects of some of the science things. And I think that goes back to social capital. Anyway, we don't know. And certainly, I don't know. You guys are the experts here. We're going to take a final break for some final messages and be back with Danielle Rice and Brett Thombs in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm enjoying my conversation tonight with Brett Thombs and Danielle Rice, two psychiatrists. Brett is the Canadian Research Chair and Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University, and Danielle Rice is Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University. And they've just recently released a major study looking at, was it 95,000 different abstracts about behavioral, impacts, mental health impacts during the pandemic. It's really quite something else. And they came to the conclusion, Danielle, that these academics that have been saying that there is this tsunami in mental health issues were wrong. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that was a bit of an over exaggeration of what actually happened. Yes.
And so all these stories and media reports were what? Just wrong? Were isolated? Were because of a crisis, we needed to come up with some stories? What do you think?
I think they were probably really great and accurate stories in terms of individuals' experiences. They know themselves best and can share what happened. But our study looks at aggregate and overall net changes. So certainly there are individuals who suffered quite tremendously. On the other end, there are individuals who are feeling a little bit better than they were prior to the pandemic. And there are those in the middle who have sort of trudged along the whole way through and experienced some resilience without much drastic change in mental health symptoms. So I think the one-off stories are probably quite accurate for that individual's perspective. It just is missing the whole, closer to a whole picture, which is what we were trying to get from our research.
And Brett, you used this word resilience quite a bit in your report, at least I think you did, and we've talked about it a lot today. Can you give me some examples of resilience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's the ideas like, again, Danielle and I both work with a group of people with a rare disease called scleroderma. It means hard skin in Greek. So it's an autoimmune disease. It turns your skin like a scabbing process. It goes internal organs. The people are we're quite vulnerable. You know, it's take immunosuppressants. And so you think no one would get harder hit but them. They're older people. They had to stay inside because they were very vulnerable to what would happen if they got infected. And, you know, they pulled together. I mentioned this earlier. They got on Zoom. They put groups together. We had people. There were people like from 15 countries linked together, and we helped link them initially because we have a network. But they got on. They ran weekly Zoom groups, and 3 years later, Brian, they're still doing this. And that's just one thing you can do. It's just kind of, you know, reaching out and taking steps you need to do what you need to do to move forward with things. Which is really important. And I think we need to be very careful about like I'm just taking a quote Danielle said somewhere else before about messaging without really having data that people aren't going to be able to cope and do this, because it really can be a killer to your hope and your ability to persevere if some experts out there telling you without really actually knowing that you're not going to be able to make this.
Danielle, I interviewed another psychiatrist a little while back, and they said resilience is like a muscle, that as you go through problems and you deal with them, your ability to deal with problems is better. And so therefore it's a muscle that if you keep using it, it becomes stronger. And I would have thought that you get problem after problem after problem. At some point in time, it's just you got to break. So is an attitude of resilience like a bone that breaks, or is it a muscle that grows stronger?
Certainly, I would agree. It's a muscle that grows stronger. And when it does feel a little bit weak, we get to lean on others who are maybe in a different place at that time. So I think that's a really nice description of it, and certainly aligns with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is sort of the core, one of the core psychotherapies that exists, that we have tools in our toolbox. The more we use them, the more helpful they are for us, the more automatic it is to be able to implement those tools when we're highly stressed. So certainly, I think that's a muscle that's growing. And when we need some support, being able to connect with others to hold us up, I think is a very helpful skill.
So Brett, final question. I took away an encouraging conclusion from your report. Should I?
Yes. We support each other. We kept on keeping on when we had to. and we need to look out for others around us and keep on looking out for others around us. So be encouraged, but let's keep an eye out and make sure that everyone around us has the support we need and we keep on helping each other out.
Brett Thombs, Danielle Rice, thank you so much for joining us. I do think that this is really encouraging information, research, news for all of us. And I like this attitude about resilience as a muscle. We got to keep using it. And Brett's comment about we keep on getting on and helping others. And I think that's key. That's our show for tonight. Thank you all, everyone, for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Montreal or Hamilton, at www.saga960am.ca. You can get all my podcasts and videocasts on briancrombie.com, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, and everywhere good podcasts are podcasted. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.